The missing ones. The chamber of the Galactic Council buzzed with the usual diplomatic murmurs, glowing holograms casting reflections across the 1,000 faces gathered from every corner of known space. Discussions of trade routes and environmental policies echoed through the hall, bouncing between delegates like lazy particles. The seat assigned to the humans, always a source of unpredictable noise, was unusually silent. No one noticed at first. Humans had a reputation for being dramatic and fashionably late. Ambassador Miles Reyes, who usually sat straight-backed and sharp-eyed in seat 247A, was absent. So were his aides. So was every human from the Terran delegation. Their section, once a maze of data pads, coffee mugs, and lively discussion, now sat neat and empty. Chairman Valor, a high-ranking member of the six-limbed Vantari, glanced once in their direction and snorted. "Emotional theatrics," he muttered, turning his gaze back to the mining dispute between the Tsar Collective and the Xylo Consortium. It wasn't until midday that the absence grew undeniable. Across the vast diplomatic complex, lights were off in the Human Affairs Office. Personal effects were gone. The human quarters were dark. Security drones reported that no humans had entered or exited since the previous cycle. They had simply vanished. The news spread through the station like static. Engineers, cooks, translators, everyone with a Terran badge was missing. All files were left in perfect order, all duties quietly concluded. Council-wide messaging systems found every human frequency offline. Automated responses now guarded once busy lines. "Thank you for your inquiry. Humanity has disengaged from Council affairs. Please refer to archived communication channels." At first, no one took it seriously. Some believed it was a protest. Humans loved grand gestures, after all. Others assumed it was a mass relocation, perhaps back to Earth, although scans of the Sol system revealed no surge in arrivals. Most dismissed it as temporary. Surely they'd return with demands or dramatic speeches. But they didn't. Across the known galaxy, human ships stopped arriving. Human-run facilities dimmed. Even colonies co-founded with other species suddenly closed their ports and activated unknown systems that blocked scanning and communication. Trade lanes once managed by human logisticians became disorganized. Terraforming operations stalled. Supply chains crumbled like brittle threads. 2 days into the silence, the Council called an emergency session. Delegates buzzed nervously. No formal complaint had been received, no conflict declared. Humanity had simply walked away. Speculations grew wilder. Had they discovered something? Were they hiding? Planning something bigger? Even more disturbing, all outbound human ships were headed away from known Council territories, toward the unknown edges of space. General Tyle of the Rigathi Defense Fleet reported, "All active human military personnel have vanished. Their weapons remain, their ships remain, but the crews are gone." Human colonies responded to no calls. Their skies showed no signs of battle, only silence. From the outside, life had stopped. But long-range scans detected movement, fleet movements, construction signals, and gravitational anomalies deep in uncharted space. Councillor Merrick of the Dretland dynasty slammed his claws on the table. "They're planning something. Humans don't go quietly." Chairman Valor tried to calm the room, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "They'll be back. They need our resources, our networks. Their economy cannot function without us." No one had the courage to say what many were starting to think. What if they never intended to come back? On the third day, an archived note surfaced, left behind by Dr. Nira Lin, head of Human Systems Integration at the Council's Terraforming Bureau. It read simply, "Thank you for the opportunity. We've moved on. Wishing you progress and peace." By the end of the week, cargo lanes were backed up across 3 sectors. Vessels floated in limbo, unsure where to unload. Human-engineered software had coordinated millions of shipments per day. Without it, confusion reigned. Minor skirmishes erupted between desperate trade guilds. Medical reports started arriving too. Species that had depended on human-designed Healthcare infrastructure were unable to replicate treatments. Human doctors, known for their intuitive understanding of complex multi-species biology, were irreplaceable. Meanwhile, in the command room of the Galactic Defense Grid, Admiral Crater watched pirate attacks increase by 170%. The humans warned us about this, he murmured. They had. Years ago, they'd introduced adaptive strategy models, predictive patrol algorithms, and flexible response units. These models had required complex training only humans had fully understood. Most of it had been brushed aside by traditional commanders, and now, without them, security systems were failing. Human warships were gone. Their software was locked. Their tactics undocumented. Council ships were responding too late, or not at all. On Kepler 8b, a terraformed agricultural world, farmers stared helplessly at malfunctioning climate stabilizers. The delicate human-calibrated weather systems were now skewed, causing crop failures. Hundreds of colonies had already begun sending refugee requests. 3 weeks passed. Not a single human had returned. Not a single human message had been answered. Then, without warning, scanners detected human ships accelerating into deep space at speeds never recorded before, far beyond known propulsion methods. They weren't fleeing. They were exploring, or leaving forever. Chairman Valor addressed the council again, this time with no certainty. We must begin diplomatic efforts immediately. We must bring them back. But the council's messages were met with only one line. Humanity is no longer part of your system, thank you. The silence that followed was not the silence of rage or war. It was the silence of being left behind. The weight of absence. The station known as Meridian Prime was once the nerve center of the Galactic Council's shipping operations. Every second, over 200 ships passed through its cargo lanes, each one guided by routing protocols established decades ago by human engineers. At the center of it all was the logistics nexus, a control system so precise it could chart 1 trillion tons of freight across 37 sectors without delay. Now it was chaos. Docking bays were filled beyond capacity. Some freighters had waited for days, others weeks. Containers piled up like forgotten ruins, their contents rotting, malfunctioning or sparking diplomatic tensions as luxury goods spoiled and critical medicines expired. The council's once celebrated efficiency had ground to a halt. Station. Chief Reelan, a seasoned navigator from the Vortari system, stood in front of the main display wall, unable to make sense of what he was seeing. We've rerouted 27 ships today, he said, and we still don't know where to send the next 10. The system won't update. His assistant, a flustered Cortel technician, shook her head. We tried bypassing the Nexus protocols and running our own numbers, but it doesn't calculate. It just throws errors. The human-designed systems weren't just complex, they were intuitive, flexible, and responsive to situational changes. Those aspects hadn't been fully documented because to the humans, it was second nature. Now, without the creators, the Council's entire trade network was unlearning how to function. In the medical core of Arcelian 9, things were worse. Dr. Trellis, a Reflari specialist in neural conditions, stood over a patient who was seizing on the table. We need neural dampeners, he said, the ones Dr. Hera used. They're locked, his assistant replied grimly. All systems require human biometric confirmation. We tried manual overrides, but the code is layered, like it's guessing our intent and blocking unsafe usage. In a drawer nearby, Dr. Hera's last journal sat unopened. Her departure, like so many others, had been silent. Her final entry: I have transferred everything. They will have to learn now. We've taught enough. Across the galaxy, human systems were unraveling, not out of malice, but because they had been constructed with such care, such personalization, that no one else truly understood them. Equipment worked only as long as humans were there to guide its operation. The balance had been so perfect it had become invisible. Until now. The Council had always assumed human contributions were replaceable. Their culture had been deemed chaotic, their diplomacy too emotional, their science unorthodox. And yet, for 50 years, they had held the galaxy together with that very chaos, emotion, and innovation. And now that thread was gone. At the Military Command Archive on Azure Station, General Vore was sifting through old battle simulations when his second-in-command, Drellick, entered with a datapad. "We've received another report. Pirate activity in the Orion Shard has doubled again. The Void Runners took down a security cruiser. No survivors." Vore barely reacted. "Send a response fleet." "We did," Drellick said quietly. "They were ambushed using flanking tactics similar to those developed by the humans during the Centauran raids." There was a long silence. "You mean the strategies they offered us 5 years ago," Vore said, "that we refused to implement?" Drellick nodded. Vore turned to the console. The names of long-departed human advisors were listed on dozens of failed battle plans. Colonel Raya Moss, Commander Anil De Santos, Analyst Zhang Wei. Teachers. All gone. With them, the improvisation had vanished, the intuition, the refusal to follow rules when rules no longer made sense. The Council's militaries were powerful but rigid. Human minds had bent the battlefield into something dynamic, something alive. Without them, it was as if the galaxy had forgotten how to think like a hunter. And still, no word from Earth. In desperation, the Council sent out diplomatic vessels to every known human colony. New Arcadia, Bastion Station, Haven's Reach. Each one responded with the same message. "Autonomous zone, no external contact. Thank you for your cooperation." When probes approached human space, they vanished. Not destroyed, just gone. As if they'd never existed. Ships dispatched beyond Council space to track human activity, never returned. No black boxes, no energy signatures, no wreckage. "They're not hiding," murmured Chairman Velor during a closed session. "They're erasing their presence." The galaxy was used to war, to attrition, to threats and ultimatums. But this was something else entirely. The humans had disengaged with such meticulous grace that it felt like a test the rest of the galaxy was failing. And the worst part? No one could blame them. They had not left in anger. They had left in disappointment. On the planet of Veltris 5, an emergency. Agricultural summit convened after the failure of the nutrient regeneration systems. These systems had been designed by human bioengineers using techniques based on Earth's permaculture and machine learning hybrids. Now, the soil was depleting faster than any model could account for. "We need to reach them," said Counselor Dravak, pounding his fist. "Offer them anything, partnership, shared governance, full control of regional space, just ask them what they want." "There's a problem," someone replied from the shadows of the room. "We no longer know where they are, and they no longer need anything from us." The silence that followed was heavy. The air itself seemed to pause. Back in the Council, Chamber Ambassador Trevek of the Hilari stood at the speaker's pedestal and said what no one else dared. "They were never the ones who needed us." He looked out across the chamber. "We were the ones being led, and we mistook leadership for immaturity. We mistook intuition for recklessness. We mistook cooperation for dependence." The chamber didn't argue, because it was true. And somewhere beyond the reaches of known space, humanity moved on, building, creating, advancing. Not because they had something to prove, but because they had always been capable of far more than anyone had ever understood. Echoes in the void it began with whispers, unconfirmed sightings in the outer spiral arms. Merchant ships passing through dead zones reported strange anomalies, massive energy readings, unnatural gravitational pulses, and glimpses of vessels that blinked into existence for a moment, only to disappear in ways that defied all known physics. The Council dismissed them at first. After all, humans had no faster-than-light capabilities beyond what had been shared with them. No known civilization possessed such mobility. But over time, the pattern became undeniable. Something, or someone, was moving through uncharted space with precision, purpose, and speed the galaxy had never witnessed before. Then came the intercept. A relay station in Sector 15, orbiting an abandoned mining moon, picked up a transmission. It was a simple pulse, a mathematical sequence encrypted using an ancient Earth pattern. The station's AI flagged it, unable to translate. But when a Deltari technician ran it through an old human decryption subroutine, it resolved into a phrase. "We remember." Do you? No return signal followed. The message was not a greeting. It was a reminder. At the Council's communication core, analysts worked day and night. Old Earth-based linguists were brought out of retirement. Human, music, art, even poetry were used as keys to decode potential follow-up messages. But nothing came. The humans were talking, but only in ways they wanted, and only through channels no longer accessible to the Council. Meanwhile, the consequences of their departure worsened. On Sikoria 3, one of the galaxy's oldest star harvesting stations shut down for the first time in a century. The core containment systems, stabilized by human energy moderators, had begun fluctuating. The alien engineers who inherited the system couldn't make sense of the designs. On the surface, the machines were simple, but the layers beneath were alien, ironically, too human. They discovered that the stabilizers worked not because of brute force, but because they predicted failure before it happened. The algorithms had been intuitive, adaptive, like a symphony constantly rewriting itself to stay in harmony. And now, the orchestra had left. "Why did we never learn how they thought?" asked the head technician, staring at the rapidly failing readouts. "Because we never thought they were worth learning from," someone replied quietly. Elsewhere, the collapse became personal. On a moon called Ilaria, a cross-species research academy had once flourished. Humans had mentored students from dozens of planets, teaching them everything from biology to ethics. Now the academy was silent. Classrooms stood empty. Dormitories were dark. In one of the old lecture halls, a student named Ralkir sat with a dusty notebook, a gift from his human mentor, Dr. Daya Nguyen. Inside were scrawled equations that combined art, science, and emotion in a way no one else could replicate. They weren't just calculations. They were reflections of thought, expressions of the way humans felt their way through science. He had spent weeks trying to understand them, but the more he studied, the more he realized he was only tracing shadows. On the final page, Dr. Nguyen had written a line. "The universe isn't a machine, it's a question. The answer changes depending on who asks it." Ralkir closed the notebook and stared out the window, hoping, foolishly, that one day his teacher might return. Back in the capital of the Galactic Council, Chairman Valor stood before the great amphitheater of delegates, his hands shaking slightly. For the first time in centuries, he felt small. The humans were builders, he said, not just of machines or systems, but of bridges. They connected everything. They made our chaos work. A murmur of agreement moved through the chamber. Even Grolm, the warlike Gentari ambassador who had once ridiculed human diplomacy as smiling with teeth, bowed his head. Delegate Alari of the Ishwan hegemony stood. "We once believed they were impatient, but what if they were simply moving at the pace required to fix a broken galaxy?" No one argued. The Council had tried to reach them through diplomatic channels. They'd offered apologies, concessions, even begged for help. All efforts were met with silence, or worse, with silence that felt intentional. And still, humans were not attacking, not mocking, not punishing. They were just gone. Or so it seemed. A scout vessel, exploring a long-dead region near the edge of the galaxy, reported something extraordinary. An artificial ring larger than any megastructure ever constructed, floating around a blue dwarf star. The entire system shimmered with a strange energy field. From its center came pulses, faint but rhythmic, human in design. The crew sent out a signal. They received only one thing in response: a visual, a human child, standing on grass beneath, twin moons holding out a hand. Beside her, alien children from at least 6 species, all smiling, all wearing the same insignia. It wasn't a threat. It was an invitation. But the coordinates embedded in the signal pointed not to that system, but somewhere beyond even the edge of the galaxy. The implication was clear. Humanity had not simply moved on. They had begun again, without war, without declarations. They were building something new, something better. Back at Council headquarters, the implication shattered the last illusions of superiority. They didn't leave because they were weak, murmured High Counselor Thess. They left because we made it clear they were not welcome to lead. Chairman Valor stared at the display. No, he said finally, voice distant. They didn't ask to lead. They simply did, and we were too proud to follow. The fracturing of old powers. The Galactic Council had always prided itself on unity, at least the illusion of it. But now that illusion cracked with every cycle. Behind polished speeches and carefully chosen diplomatic words, fear was spreading. The kind of fear only silence could create. The kind of fear that came when the smartest people in the galaxy realized they'd made a mistake they couldn't undo. The first member to leave was the Altari Republic. In a terse message, delivered without ceremony, Ambassador Selvek announced that Altari would be withdrawing from Council governance to pursue independent exploration and resource management initiatives. What they didn't say, but everyone understood, was that they were following the humans, searching for the same path that had been hidden to them for so long. Next came the Deltari Concord, then the Kievan Nomad clans, then 5 more systems, within weeks. Each one had relied heavily on human systems, human training, or human advisors. And each had decided it was easier to start anew than to fix what had been left broken. The council tried to hold them together. Chairman Valor pleaded for patience, promising reforms, transparency, even shared leadership. But the truth was undeniable. There was no leadership left to share. The architects had gone. On the moons of Centhara Prime, a technological catastrophe illustrated the fragility of their dependency. The orbital stabilization array, engineered and maintained by human specialists, began to collapse. The moons had once been celebrated for their harmony, orbiting in perfect balance with gravitational tethers installed a generation ago. Now, one of those tethers was failing. The Centharan engineers tried to adjust the stabilizers manually, but they couldn't make sense of the cascading feedback loops. The system's predictive AI had been designed by Dr. Leah Cross, a human physicist whose work combined temporal microadjustments with gravitational curvature theory. It was brilliant and incomprehensible. She always said the system didn't predict physics, it listened to it, muttered the lead engineer, staring helplessly at the spiraling data stream. The council dispatched ships to help. None arrived in time. One of the moons broke orbit and crashed into its sibling, causing a planetary tidal disaster. The Centharan homeworld suffered a 7% biosphere loss in a single day. Millions died. No one called it an accident. They called it a consequence. At the edge of the Liosh Belt, a fleet of pirate ships surrounded a trading convoy. Once this would have been routine, an automated distress signal sent, a rapid human-led response unit arriving in minutes. Now the convoy was alone. Captain Elena Threx, a half-Mivari merchant, tried every known defense. Her ships were decently armed. Her crew was trained. But the pirates had learned from humans too. They used human weapons, tactics, even language. "Brace for breach," she told her crew. "No help is coming." They fought hard. They lost. Half the cargo was taken. 6 crew members were killed. The pirates broadcast a message before leaving. "This is the new order. No more council protection. No more Terran peacekeeping. Learn to defend yourselves." The transmission spread like wildfire. Back on the council's capital station, emergency meetings now occurred every hour. Delegates who once spent months arguing over taxation were now panicking over food shortages, collapsed transport lanes, dying colonies. Ambassador Juno Ka, from the waterworld Thalmaris, slammed her fins on the console. You promised us stability. You said Earth was a partner, not a pillar. You lied. Chairman Valor sat quietly, his hands folded. He was aging fast, visibly worn down by 5 years of trying to hold together something built on invisible human threads. We believed they needed us, he said. We believed that we were mentoring them. And what are we now? Asked Grolm of the Gentari, his growling voice heavy. Children left in the ruins of a school we never realized was theirs. In quiet corners, resistance brewed, not violent resistance, but cultural. Alien artists began copying human design. Engineers studied the only surviving human textbooks. Children in mixed colonies began speaking Terran English in the streets, adopting its idioms. They wore t-shirts printed with Earth slogans and made jewelry based on human constellations. It was as if they were trying to remember something they had only just realized they'd forgotten. On the fringe planet of Varelli, a small university had once dismissed its human philosophy department as too emotionally driven. Now those old recorded lectures had become priceless. Professor Ewan Reese's holograms, once underattended, were now studied word for word. Progress is not made by avoiding mistakes, he had said, but by embracing questions no one else dares to ask. Students recited his words like scripture. Meanwhile, in space far beyond the Council's edge, new signals flickered, mathematical bursts arranged in fractals, pulses timed with the rhythm of human heartbeats, songs encoded in quantum harmonics. These were not calls for help. They were not warnings. They were beacons. Humanity wasn't hiding. They were building. Not another council. Not another empire. Something different. Something better. And they weren't inviting everyone. Only those who were willing to learn. Back on Nexus Station, a small crew gathered around a monitor. A message had arrived from the edge of known space. It wasn't signed, it wasn't traceable, but it was unmistakably human. The galaxy is still beautiful. We're just building a version that knows how to see it. The crew stared at the screen in silence. No one said a word, because for the first time in a long time they understood. They hadn't lost a member of the council. They had lost the compass. And now, all they had left was the stars. And a question they were too late to ask. Lessons in absence too. Years after the humans vanished, a strange silence hung over the galaxy. Not the quiet of peace, but the dull hum of machinery no longer understood, and systems that worked until they didn't. This silence was louder than any battle cry. At the Galactic Strategic Academy on Thalanis Prime, instructors had begun removing human case studies from their curriculum, not out of disrespect, but because they could no longer explain them. One by one, the lectures on human military improvisation were replaced with vague summaries. Charts, once filled with actionable plans, were now historical footnotes. Instructors confessed, sometimes with tears, "We don't understand how they did it." Cadets, eager, brilliant, disciplined, could not grasp the logic behind doctrines that once seemed chaotic, but had kept entire sectors safe. Human teachings had revolved around intuition, unpredictability, and trust in decentralized decision-making. But alien minds, trained for generations in order and hierarchy, struggled to replicate it. "We don't need to understand them," insisted Admiral Cale Throst during a council broadcast. "We need to return to our own systems. We survived before them, we'll survive after them." But deep down, everyone knew that wasn't true. The Council hadn't survived before humans. It had endured. And endurance without evolution was no longer enough. On Valus 7, the galaxy's leading agricultural think tank launched Project Reroute, a mission to re-establish sustainable crop cycles without human influence. The scientists were brilliant, the intentions noble. But within 3 harvests, the project failed. Entire crop lines collapsed due to unforeseen microbial mutations. The old human database had included a simple correction, a strain of bacteria designed to self-regulate nitrogen levels. It had been so small, so obvious, so human, and no one had thought to check for it. "I thought they just liked playing with DNA," one lead geneticist muttered. But they weren't playing. They saw what we didn't. The failures weren't isolated anymore. They were stacking. Economic markets lost their rhythm. Medical systems grew overwhelmed with multi-species. Cases no longer treatable. Security sectors descended into regional fiefdoms. The galaxy wasn't falling into war. It was falling into disorganization, and that was worse. At the Outer Edge Observatory, an old Grelix scientist named Professor Volt sat watching the strange pulses again. He had been tracking them for over a year, bright, structured light patterns traveling between stars, far outside known trade routes. He knew they were human. They used no known spectrum, yet his ancient Terran-made filter caught just enough. The lights danced like Morse code, except faster, more elegant. Not random. Not distress. A conversation. But with whom? He compiled all the pulses, played them over and over, trying to break the patterns. Then one night he caught something new. A rhythmic loop, building like a song. Suddenly, his screen glowed, with 3 English words: "We are listening." He stared at them for hours. It wasn't a broadcast. It was a response. And it wasn't for the council. It was for those who had paid attention. Word of the message spread quietly among scientists, students, traders, those who still believed in curiosity over control. They began to look at the old Earth archives again. Not the sanitized documents the council had kept, but the human stories. Fiction, music, mathematics, poetry. Each one felt like a piece of something bigger, a puzzle they'd never realized was in front of them. In the Zothari archives, a student uncovered a forgotten Earth recording. A Terran physicist once mocked for her bizarre theories on quantum pattern memory. But her algorithms perfectly matched the pulse patterns now lighting the edge of the galaxy. What if we were never meant to understand their machines? The student asked her professor. What if we were meant to feel our way into understanding them? On isolated worlds and quiet corridors, that thought spread. Perhaps humanity hadn't been primitive. Perhaps they had simply been different, and different, when dismissed, becomes invisible. On the planet, Nirotha, a multi-species orphanage, once run by a group of Terran caretakers, now stood empty. The children remained, cared for by well-meaning volunteers. But something had changed. Where once there had been laughter, now there was discipline. Where once there had been chaos mixed with affection, now there was order without joy. One child, part Zothari, part human, drew pictures in the dirt, stars, circles, spirals. She sang to herself in an Earth lullaby that none of the new caretakers could translate. When asked where she learned it, she only said, "It's in the lights now." On the bridge of an exploratory cruiser, Captain Lyon of the Valari Alliance received an unusual report. A mining colony on the far side of the galaxy had been restored, fully operational, despite having gone dark 5 years ago. No known council ship had visited. No emergency repair team had been dispatched, yet the systems were running smoothly. Using a hybrid interface no one recognized, a note had been left behind in the colony's logbook. It read, "Keep your people warm. You matter more than you were told." No signature, no trace, just a presence, fleeting, quiet, intentional. The humans hadn't just disappeared. They were watching, helping, but only from a distance. Back in the council, arguments continued. Accusations flew. Conspiracies bloomed. Fear hardened into resentment. "They think they're better than us," Ambassador Durnell snarled. "That they can judge us from afar." "No," countered Elder Fan, a gentle archivist. "I think they just stopped needing to be seen. In the end, that was the lesson." Humans had given the galaxy everything, freely, imperfectly, passionately, and the galaxy had dismissed them, but humanity had not retaliated. They hadn't destroyed or dominated. They had simply stepped aside, and in doing so they had become something greater, a mystery, a myth, a mirror to every species still trapped in their own pride. The garden. Beyond the stars 5 years to the day after the last human left known space, something new appeared. A structure, not a station, not a ship, a living construct, orbiting a blue supergiant in the Naris expanse, a region long thought uninhabitable. It spanned thousands of kilometers, wrapped in rings of greenery and cascading waterfalls that shimmered in artificial gravity. Trees floated in domes of glass. Aquatic rivers spiraled upward in defiance of physics, and at its heart, a symbol, one recognized only by those who once studied Earth. An open hand, palm facing up. It was not a message of control. It was an invitation. To understand, the Council dispatched a delegation, led by Ambassador Thasari, one of the few remaining members who had once worked alongside human counterparts. The delegation approached cautiously, broadcasting every known diplomatic frequency, every known Terran dialect. No weapons were visible, no defenses activated, yet every scan failed. The structure resisted analysis like a dream dissolving upon waking. Finally, a signal came, not through sound but through emotion. Each delegate experienced something different, a memory, a thought, a voice from the past. Some wept. Others collapsed from the intensity. For Thasari, it was the voice of her old friend Rico Evans, the human engineer who once taught her how to think in circles instead of lines. She heard his laughter. She heard him say, "Now you see it, don't you?" Then the vision faded, and the delegation was gently returned to their ship, which found itself somehow back in Council space, 3 weeks' travel away, though only seconds had passed. No explanation, no damage, no threats, just a gift. The report rocked the galaxy, and then humanity spoke. One final transmission. This time, it was direct, broadcast on an open galactic channel. Anyone with a receiver could hear it. It began with a voice, warm, strong, unmistakably human. "Hello again." The voice belonged to Jalen Vega, former human cultural liaison to the Council, long thought lost during the evacuation of the Sol border colonies. His image appeared next. He looked older, yes, but calm, peaceful, dressed in clothes no one recognized, woven from living threads that shimmered with ambient light. You've wondered where we went, why we left. Some of you have feared we were plotting something, others hoped we'd return to fix the things we once built. He paused. We left because you stopped listening. And we realized we didn't have to stay in the room where no one was interested in learning. Across the galaxy, beings of all species froze in place, traitors, soldiers, children, elders, watching, listening. We did not leave in anger, and we did not leave in arrogance. We left because we discovered something greater than power or prestige. He stepped aside, revealing a background that seemed to stretch into stars, cities made of glass and light, children from dozens of species, laughing together under a triple sunset. We found those who wanted to grow with us, not above us, not below us. With us. He looked into the camera again. We were never primitive. We were never broken. We were different. And difference, when nurtured, becomes strength. When dismissed, it becomes absence. A pause. Some of you are angry. That's okay. Some of you are sad. We are too. But we are not coming back. Not the way we were. The world you built was never meant for the kind of collaboration we offered. So we built something else. A final image appeared. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a thread. It was a garden, not metaphorically. A literal garden, blooming on a planet with unknown coordinates. Trees from Earth growing alongside alien flora. Bees dancing with floating light orbs. Sculptures formed from code and memory. We call it the garden. Not because it's perfect, but because it grows. Vega smiled. If you find us again, you'll be welcomed. But you won't find us by following ships or coordinates. You'll find us by growing, by changing, by unlearning what you thought was hierarchy, and discovering what cooperation really means. He reached forward, touched the screen. Until then, be kind to one another. The universe is wide, and you are not alone. Then silence, but not the cold silence from before. A silence filled with possibility. Across the galaxy, shifts began. Not enforced, not ordered. Chosen. On remote colonies, old human educational modules were reinstated. On Kepler 3, a team of alien engineers began decoding a forgotten Terran operating system, not to copy it, but to understand the thinking behind it. In hidden corners of the network, anonymous messages began circulating, snippets of human philosophy, design principles, songs, not propaganda, just seeds, and some began to sprout. On Zerith's moon, a class of young students, none of them human, built the galaxy's first post-human drone using recovered Terran blueprints and their own enhancements. They named it Hyraeath, a word they could not translate but felt deeply anyway. On the diplomatic floor of the council, a motion was quietly filed by the Tessellari ambassador. Initiate Project Humani, a commitment to humility, creativity, and collaborative exploration. The motion passed without debate. No one wanted to admit it aloud, but everyone knew. They had witnessed the quiet ascension of a species once dismissed as primitive, and they would never look at humanity, or themselves, the same way again. When the stars remembered decades past, the galaxy had changed, not in the dramatic, war-torn way history books used to warn about, but slowly, like dawn crawling over a frozen landscape. The old institutions of power remained, hollowed and restructured. The Galactic Council still existed, though now it was no longer a tower looking down. It had become a circle, one where younger species were given equal voice, not simply tolerated but heard. This transformation hadn't come from rules or votes. It had come from absence. In the long silence humanity left behind, something else had filled the void. Reflection. Entire generations had grown up in a galaxy that only remembered humans through their systems, their machines, their teachings, their art. There were no embassies, no flags, no armies, just stories. And in those stories, humanity had evolved into something more than a species. They had become a lesson. On a backwater world called Larian 6, a former Terran colony long abandoned, an interspecies research outpost was founded. Its members didn't come from legacy worlds or aristocratic systems. They were dreamers, tinkerers, students, and they had one goal: to understand how humans had thought, not just what they built, but why they built it the way they did. Their focus wasn't on imitation. It was on resonance. A Threxian biologist learned how humans used art to model protein folding. A Siliconite philosopher reinterpreted quantum entanglement through human metaphors. A young hybrid child composed a musical language based entirely on Earth lullabies. They called it the Weaver's Project. Their belief? That the universe had threads unseen, patterns that only revealed themselves when viewed through the chaotic, compassionate, and curious lens humans had championed. And one day, it worked. The outpost developed a new kind of communication, array, not based on speed, frequency, or power, but on emotional pattern recognition. A strange idea, rooted in a discarded human theory that emotions could be encoded in quantum vibration. It had long been mocked, until they activated it and received an answer. It was not words, not data. It was a feeling, the collective sensation of being known, of being seen, of being welcomed. Home. Half the outpost wept. The others simply sat in stunned silence. The next day, a ship arrived. It didn't decloak. It didn't broadcast. It just appeared, shaped like a seed, wrapped in living metal and pulsing with light. The door opened and out stepped a woman. Human, but not. Her body shimmered with symbiotic mesh. Her eyes glowed softly with layered consciousness. She smiled, like someone who had been waiting for centuries. "I am Ellen Marin," she said, her voice like water and light. I was born among the stars that bloom beyond your maps. And I am here because you are ready. The outpost didn't erupt into cheers or panic. They simply listened. And she told them a story of how humanity had gone beyond the galaxy, not to conquer, but to learn. Of civilizations they had met who communicated with scent, with silence, with dreams. Of worlds shaped by intention, planets that sang, stars that responded to kindness. She told them of the garden, now a civilization spanning galaxies, not ruled by humans, but grown with them. Where every being, no matter how small, strange, or ancient, was offered not a place to serve, but a space to become. And she said, "You have always had the seed. You just needed time to water it." Then she placed something in the hands of a Varnari child, a small crystalline device glowing with warmth. When activated, it projected a single symbol, a spiral of stars surrounding a single blue dot. Earth. Remembered. Ellen Marin did not stay. She walked back into her ship and vanished without sound or flare, like a leaf carried by a breeze. But the device she left behind? It began to teach, not facts, not commands, but perspectives, new ways of thinking, new ways of seeing. And across the galaxy, other devices appeared, quietly, in places of growth, in libraries, in orphanages, in temples, in farms and art schools, in music halls. They taught not what humans had done, but how they saw. And in that vision, others began to see themselves, not as pieces in a machine, but as sparks in a sky wide enough for every kind of light. The galaxy was no longer trying to recover what it had lost. It was finally learning to understand why it had been gifted it in the first place. No monuments were built, no flags were flown, but in every language, one phrase became sacred. They left to become more, and by doing so they taught us we could too. In time, the stars themselves seemed different, closer, kinder, more like questions than threats. And somewhere, in the quiet heart of the universe, humanity watched, not as gods, not as rulers, but as gardeners, tending the soil of civilizations that had once dismissed them, now blooming in their light.